I never imagined that an ordinary delivery would circle back into my life a few hours later and quietly rearrange the entire shape of my day. It happened on one of those muted mornings that feel half faded before they even begin, the kind where the light coming through the windows looks tired, and the air seems to linger in every room longer than it should. My kettle hissed on the stove, my coffee tasted like it had forgotten how to be comforting, and the house creaked around me in a way that made the quiet feel heavier than usual. Living alone has its steady rhythms, and usually I welcome them. But sometimes the stillness settles in your bones and makes everything feel slightly out of tune. I wandered through the rooms without any real purpose, brushing my fingers over framed photos, adjusting a pillow here or there, opening windows only to close them again. I wasn't expecting anything or anyone, so when the doorbell rang late in the morning, the sound jolted through the house like a pebble dropped into a still pond. At the door stood a delivery driver I didn't recognize. He looked to be somewhere in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, with that mild, approachable expression people get when they're trying to stay. Polite despite running on a schedule that probably leaves little room for conversation. His uniform wasn't anything remarkable, but he wore it with a certain ease. His smile wasn't the quick, practiced kind I'd grown accustomed to seeing. It felt real, warm even, and it lingered just long enough to make me wonder if he always greeted people like that, or if this moment was unusual for him, too. He verified my name, handed over a medium-sized box, and offered a small nod as though acknowledging something more than just a standard delivery. I thanked him, and he replied with a tone that carried a hint of familiarity, as if we had exchanged pleasantries before, though I was certain we hadn't. Then he walked back down the path and disappeared behind the hedge that borders my front lawn. I set the box on my kitchen counter, sliced the tape open, and discovered the replacement clippers I had ordered weeks ago and forgotten about. Nothing impressive, nothing life-changing. But as I held those metal shears, I realized the one part of the delivery still lingering in my mind wasn't the package. It was the driver's expression. Something about the way he looked at me stayed in my thoughts longer than it should have. I shook my head at myself. When you've lived long enough with long stretches of quiet, even a simple, sincere smile can feel like a spark. Small but bright enough to cut through a gray morning. Hours passed. The light outside shifted from dull to soft, and eventually the sky cleared just enough to tease the idea of a better afternoon. I slipped into my gardening gloves and went out back to trim some plants. I lost myself in the rhythm of clipping stems, gently twisting stubborn vines free, listening to birds hop through branches like a chorus practicing their lines. Time moved easily, and my mind drifted through memories, hopes, and the comfortable repetition of simple tasks. So when the doorbell rang a second time that day, I almost jumped. I brushed off my gloves, hurried to the front door, and opened it without much thought. There he was again, the same delivery driver, but this time he wasn't holding anything. Not a box, not a clipboard, not even his usual scanner. Just himself. Just that warm, slightly worn expression, now softened by something thoughtful. He caught his breath as though he had walked faster than he planned. For a moment he seemed unsure of whether he should even be standing there. He said my name again, gently, as if testing the waters to make sure he hadn't made a mistake returning. I nodded, curious, and not entirely sure why my heart gave a small, uninvited flutter of anticipation. He told me he had been thinking about our brief exchange earlier that morning. He said he had seen something in my face when I opened the door. A look that reminded him of something he'd seen in his own reflection during difficult seasons in his life. He apologized if his return seemed strange, but he felt compelled to come back and offer a small bit of encouragement, the kind someone once gave him at a time he needed it most. He shifted his weight and looked down for a moment, searching for the right words, then lifted his gaze with a steadiness that surprised me. He said he hoped I knew that even in passing moments as brief as a package handoff, people sometimes see us more clearly than we imagine. His words weren't dramatic, weren't flirtatious, weren't even especially poetic. They were simply honest. And honesty, when paired with sincerity, has a way of slipping past our defenses without warning. I felt a warmth rise in my chest, something tender and unexpected. Before I could reply, he added that he didn't want to intrude or make me uncomfortable. He only wanted to say what had been on his mind, then let me get back to my day. Something inside me didn't want him to leave just yet, not for any grand reason, nothing romantic or impulsive, just because real kindness, the unforced kind, is rare enough that turning it away felt wrong. I told him he hadn't overstepped. In fact, I said his words had lifted something I hadn't quite known how to put into language. A hint of relief crossed his expression. Something subtle and human. Something that made me feel as though we had both stepped into a moment neither of us expected. I invited him to sit for a moment on the small wooden bench near the walkway. It wasn't bold or suggestive, just a gesture of goodwill between two people caught in a moment that felt quietly meaningful. He agreed with a soft nod. We sat with a comfortable space between us, listening to the faint rustle of leaves moving along the pavement. The quiet didn't feel awkward. It felt natural, like the space between thoughts. He introduced himself properly, telling me his name was Rowan. He explained that he had only been on this delivery route for a few months and that he was still learning the most efficient ways to navigate the winding streets. Before this job, he worked in a hardware store, a detail that made sense when he talked about tools and household fixes with casual confidence. He mentioned how he still occasionally relied on his GPS too much, and when he joked about getting lost in the same cul-de-sac twice in one afternoon, I actually laughed. Genuinely, not out of politeness. Then he spoke more seriously. He told me why he had returned. When I had opened my door earlier, he had caught a fleeting expression on my face. Not sadness exactly, but something quiet and heavy. He said he recognized it because he had worn that same expression during a chapter of his life when everything felt unsettled. Someone had reached out to him on a difficult day, and it made a difference. He wanted to offer me the same simple courtesy. His honesty disarmed me. Something in me softened. I found myself speaking openly, sharing things I hadn't planned to say aloud. How living alone can be peaceful but also create long stretches of silence that feel too thick. How changes in my life recently had made my routines wobble slightly. Not catastrophic changes, just enough to leave a weight that lingered longer than it should. He listened, truly listened. Not with quick nods or rushed affirmations, but with the kind of patience that feels rare these days. His presence didn't feel intrusive. It felt grounding. When he asked about my garden, I smiled, telling him it was my sanctuary, sometimes overgrown, sometimes a bit unorganized, but always comforting. He pointed out a few plants by name, surprising me with how much he knew. I felt pride blooming quietly inside me as I described their care, their growth, and why I had chosen them. Minutes slipped by unnoticed. There was an ease between us, a sense of familiarity without explanation. He told me he admired how openly I spoke, how steady I seemed even while navigating uncertain times. Compliments like that don't come often, especially from someone who means them. I felt myself absorbing his words like cool water on a warm day. Then he shared a piece of his own story. Not dramatic, just honest. He talked about starting over after leaving a long-term job, trying to reorient himself, adjusting to new routines that felt unfamiliar. As he spoke, I recognized the same quiet weight in his gaze that he had noticed in mine. When he checked the time and mentioned he needed to return to his route, I nodded, though a small part of me wished the conversation could have stretched a little longer. Before standing, he asked if it would be all right if he said hello whenever he happened to deliver in the neighborhood again. Nothing formal, nothing expected, just a friendly check-in if circumstances allowed. I agreed without hesitation. He left with a small wave, and as I watched him walk down the path, something inside me felt different, steadier, lighter, subtly realigned. Not transformed in a dramatic way, but nudged gently toward something I didn't realize I had been missing. The next morning felt changed, not with excitement or anticipation exactly, but with a new clarity in the air. The house felt less empty, the rooms felt less weighted. I performed my morning tasks with more intention, folding blankets neatly, nursing my coffee slowly, watching the sunlight move across the floor like a slow spreading warmth. I reminded myself that I barely knew Rowan, that he was simply someone who had shown genuine kindness on a day when I needed it. Still, his presence lingered in my thoughts with a soft steadiness I couldn't ignore. Before noon, I found myself back in the garden, trimming a few stray leaves that didn't truly need trimming. I told myself I wasn't waiting for anything. But every time I heard the rumble of a truck in the distance, a small flicker of curiosity rose in my chest. When a delivery vehicle eventually turned onto my street, I tried to keep my focus on the plants in front of me, telling myself it was nothing unusual. The truck slowed, then stopped. Footsteps sounded along the walkway. I turned before I could stop myself. Rowan stood there, holding a small padded envelope. He lifted it with a playful shrug, claiming he wasn't sure whether it was meant to arrive today or tomorrow, but his scanner insisted it was destined for my doorstep that very moment. I smiled, accepting the envelope and feeling a small flutter I didn't care to analyze too deeply. It contained a set of replacement light bulbs, hardly noteworthy, but the timing of his arrival, whether by chance or the gentle hand of fate, made the moment feel quietly significant. He asked how my morning had been, and I told him truthfully that it felt brighter than the day before. A small smile tugged at his lips. Then he glanced toward the garden and offered to help with anything that might need tending before he continued his route. I hesitated, not wanting to take advantage of his time, but he insisted in a gentle, unpressured way. We walked to a stubborn patch of overgrown vine I'd been struggling with. Rowan crouched down and studied it with the kind of focus someone might give a puzzle. Watching him work was unexpectedly calming. His movements were measured, his explanations clear. He didn't rush. He didn't grumble. He simply untangled the vines in careful, steady motions, talking about gardening tips his father taught him when he was young. I found myself watching him rather than the plants, noticing small details, the concentration in his brow, the patient rhythm of his hands, the quiet way he spoke. There was something unassuming and grounded about him, something rare. I told him he wasn't overstepping by helping, and he looked up at me with an expression that said my words meant something to him. When he stood and the sun caught the dust on his sleeves, he looked almost peaceful. Then he said something that stayed with me long after he left. Helping in the garden, he said, made him feel more anchored than anything had in a while. Talking with me had made him feel centered in a way he hadn't expected. Hearing that touched something deep inside me, a feeling not of romance but of connection, the kind that reminds you human kindness can slip into your life at any age. Before leaving, he asked if I might be around later in the week. I told him I likely would be. He smiled softly and said he would keep an eye out during his rounds. Days passed, each carrying a subtle change in me. The world felt a bit more vibrant. The colors in my home seemed warmer. Even the quiet didn't feel quite as heavy. I moved through my days with more awareness, not waiting, not expecting, just open. On the third afternoon, as I hauled a bag of soil toward the backyard, I heard the familiar rumble of a delivery truck slowing near my home. I didn't turn immediately. I reminded myself that this was a working neighborhood with packages coming and going constantly. But then the footsteps approached, those same measured, deliberate footsteps. When I turned, Rowan was walking up the path, carrying a small potted plant with soft orange blossoms, shaped like little lanterns. He held it out with a slightly shy smile, saying he had picked it up during his lunch break because the colors reminded him of my garden. He said it wasn't anything extravagant, just a small thank you for the calm and honesty of our conversations. The gesture reached deeper than he probably realized. We sat on the bench again, the same one where our first real conversation had unfolded. The afternoon air was gentle, shadows stretching softly across the ground as branches swayed above us. Rowan talked about his week, how the days felt less chaotic lately, how he felt more grounded. Then he grew quiet, thoughtful. He told me he had been thinking about connection, how rare it is to meet someone later in life who quietly wakes up parts of you that had gone still, someone who makes you pause and breathe and feel present again. He said I had done that for him, Something warm and full blossomed inside me. I told him he had done the same for me, that his unexpected kindness had reminded me to look at my days with fresh eyes, that his presence had brought a steady warmth back into my life. We didn't need to say much after that. The moment itself held meaning without extra words. He asked if it would be all right for us to keep sharing these small exchanges whenever life allowed. Nothing formal, nothing planned, just natural conversations whenever our paths crossed. I agreed with a soft smile that felt more honest than anything I had worn in a long time. When he stood to leave, he placed a hand lightly on the back of the bench, not touching me, just steadying himself in a gesture that carried quiet respect. He said he hoped the plant would brighten my garden, and that he looked forward to seeing how it settled in next time he passed by. After he drove off, I carried the plant to the backyard, choosing a spot where the sunlight glowed warmest. As I pressed the soil around it and stepped back, I realized that the true delivery that had changed my day wasn't the box from the morning. It wasn't even the plant in my hands. It was the kindness he had carried back to my doorstep. It was the recognition. It was the reminder that even when life feels quiet, connection can still arrive, unexpected and gentle, like a soft knock on the door you didn't know you needed.